They suspected this guy's on the run with his beautiful young girlfriend. They're never gonna find him.
He never showed up for a sentencing hearing. It's a simple case of take the money and run.
And everybody starts saying that they skipped the country, and I said no, because she would not leave her boys. Her boys were her life.
This was someone he trusted more than anyone.
It becomes crystal clear that he's been betrayed by his friend.
Bodies have been found on this property on Mount Olivet Road.
Now we're up to 2 bodies and possibly more.
Breaks my heart that they had to go through that.
My name is Lisa Sands. I am Tammy Facet's oldest sister, and she was my best friend. Growing up, we really did have some good times. She was more into fashion and makeup and dress up. She was more prissy. She wasn't quite the tomboy like I was. She hated guns. She hated hunting. She hated fishing. She would rather stay home by herself and read or something. My teachers would always say, "Why can't you be more like your sister, Tammy?"
This area is really steeped in family tradition. It just conjures up the images of real America and the hardworking people who live here.
We have our more metropolitan areas, and they're surrounded by our suburban areas, and it gets country really fast around here.
When you go there, it's like you're stepping back in time. Small town, people work really hard, and everybody knows everybody's business.
In 2001, Tammy Facet is a single mom. She's living with her sister and her 2 kids from 2 failed relationships, but she has not given up on love. She meets a pharmacist named Michael Kurkowski, and instantly they connect.
Michael Kurkowski lived a life commensurate with a pharmacist raising 2 young boys. Michael went through a tumultuous divorce, and his parents were happy that he'd been moving forward.
Tammy worked as a waitress at a bagel donut shop near Michael's pharmacy. Michael would pop in and get a coffee, a bagel, a donut, and it began with small talk. And it blossomed into a very tight relationship between those 2.
Michael would order lunch and she would take it over. When I would go down to the pharmacy to see them, I could tell how much he really cared for her. I do know that he did buy her not a diamond ring, but a ring that had 3 diamond stones in it. She wore it on her middle finger. He treated her like a queen. He loved her to death. I think Tammy really was looking for a further future with Michael and his kids and her kids. I knew they were probably gonna get married, is what I was hoping for.
But you just don't know a person until you are with them for some length of time. And it turns out that Tammy did have a huge revelation coming about Michael, one that was going to put both of them under the magnifying glass.
Michael Kurkowski had nothing to say today as he was led away by police right outside the business he's owned and operated for the last 1.5 years, the medicine shop in Eaton Township.
Michael Kurkowski was filling orders for OxyContin from phony or expired prescriptions. From there, Michael just began selling drugs to whoever had the cash. So Michael had become a drug dealer.
Michael's activities took me off guard. I don't think Tammy was aware of Mike's extracurricular activities.
Tammy Facet had little or no knowledge of what Michael had been doing.
Michael Kurkowski was the perfect front for this kind of an operation. I mean, he was a stand-up father and a son. You would never have imagined that that pharmacy was the backdrop for one of the biggest drug dealing operations in the country.
Michael Kurkowski was rumored to have amassed over $1 million in cash.
Really, at this point, Michael's problems were kind of white-collar crimes. He'd been charged and he was going to have to leave his profession, but he had money. He could pay the bond and try to put his life back together. But then his problems got much, much worse.
One of the people that he was dealing drugs to died. It led back to Michael Kurkowski. And it really opened up the door to the investigation into Kurkowski.
No matter what, Tammy loved Michael. She went to court with him. She didn't tell me a whole lot about what's going on. She just wanted me to know that she was happy and she was standing by her man.
She supports him all the way through his trial, and he finally pleads no contest to the drug charges. With sentencing just 3 weeks away, Michael and Tammy have been trying to lead a normal life, right up until one day in early May of 2002.
It was a Friday. She was supposed to pick Jonathan up after school, and she never showed up. When she didn't come home, I really got panicky because she would not leave her boys.
Michael Kurkowski was also supposed to pick up his kids from daycare, and he was a no-show too.
No one knew where Michael was, and it was very out of character for him not to be responsible and pick up the boys.
Saturday morning came, and I must have called 20 times in less than 24 hours. And all I would get was Mike's answering machine. Mr. and Mrs. Kurkowski Sr. were at Michael Jr.'s house.
Lisa came over to Michael's house, and they sat in the driveway with lawn chairs for hours and hours, waiting for them to come home. And that Monday morning, Mr. and Mrs. Kurkowski finally went to the police station and filed a missing persons report on Michael Kurkowski.
Mr. and Mrs. Kurkowski came to my office to talk about their missing son. We checked as many places as we could, his bank records, credit card usage, nothing was being used. But we knew that he was about to be sentenced for some drug violations.
The police knew Michael Kurkowski, so they were suspicious.
To the cops, this was a no-brainer. If Michael Kurkowski had as much money as they thought he had, to him, losing the bail money would be well worth the price of freedom.
Who should be behind bars, but Kurkowski never showed up for a sentencing hearing, forfeiting $450,000 bail money. With no evidence of foul play, the DA says it's a simple case of take the money and run.
We had every expectation that he would have had vast cash resources to use.
They suspected this guy's on the run with his beautiful young girlfriend, and they're never gonna find him.
Michael and Tammy vanished off the face of the earth.
About a month before she went missing, Tammy said to the boys, would you mind moving to a different country? Like maybe Brazil or something like that. And I thought she was just joking, and I said, you're not leaving your family.
And when Michael and Tammy were reported missing, Michael became a fugitive of the week, which, all the media picks it up.
The media talked about my sister Tammy like she was a drug dealer. They just talked about her being Michael Kurkowski's girlfriend instead of a human being. And it made me mad. It made me seriously mad.
Tammy Fassett, Kurkowski's girlfriend, was also missing. Her family believed foul play was involved and made public pleas.
It was not like her to go somewhere and not tell her family or her children where she was going.
Once law enforcement decides that Michael and Tammy have left the country, that becomes the focus of all their efforts. But the question remained, where'd they go?
This crime occurred just 6 months after 9/11. You could still travel without showing your passport at point of exit. There was nothing to indicate that they had flown out because there was no passport records of leaving the airport at that time.
How do you check every country and every possible destination? There didn't seem to be any real trail to follow.
The cops changed their focus yet again. If Tammy and Michael did flee, then the cops are now betting they had help. So it's back to interviewing more coworkers and family and friends. And in that effort, one name keeps popping up. And it's a guy who seems like the polar opposite of Michael. An ex-con named Hugo Selensky.
So Hugo Selensky was in a romantic relationship with a woman named Carrie Bartu. She happened to be the first cousin of the estranged wife of Michael Kurkowski. Carrie was borrowing some money from Michael, and Hugo had taken her to Michael's house and was introduced to Michael Kurkowski for the first time.
Michael was aware that Hugo had been behind bars, and Michael leaned into Hugo, and Hugo used that as an opportunity to help him. I've been there. Here's what you need to do.
He convinced Michael that he can help him through his legal troubles. He was going to aid Michael in giving him advice, and if he was convicted, prepare for his life in prison.
Michael Kurkowski was not the kind of guy that would fare well in prison. He was kind of a nerdy guy. He was overweight. He was a simple guy. And Michael was scared.
I think Michael Kurkowski looked at Hugo Selensky as the cool kid in school.
I made contact with Hugo Selensky, and I did interview him. I spoke with him for an hour and a half. I felt like he had some involvement in the missing person, but what that involvement was very unclear.
All this time, Hugo has been telling the police that he has no idea where Michael and Tammy could be. But when he knocks on the door of Michael's parents' house, he has a very different story.
2 or 3 months after their son disappeared, Hugo went to their parents' house and said, "Your son's alive. You know, I know people who can contact him."
Their son is alive. This is incredible news to the Kurkowskis. He told Michael's parents that he was laying low and putting together a new defense.
Michael's parents, at this point, had gotten no answers from law enforcement. They went from being hopeless to having some hope. And then Hugo Selensky said, "I know Michael has money here at your house. Give me that money and I will get it to him. He needs it." The fact that Hugo knew about that money could have only come from Michael.
Hugo tells Michael's parents that Michael has requested to not contact him. He doesn't want his parents to be charged with aiding and abetting a fugitive. They trust Hugo.
On this visit, the family gave Hugo $30,000. On a second visit a month later in August, they gave him another $30,000. But it was on that third visit in September the family really became suspicious.
Mr. Kurkowski met with Hugo, and he said, "We'll give you the money, but we need to talk to our son."
Hugo pulled out a handgun, said, "I know there's more money hidden in this house. I want it right now." Fires a shot. He was almost killed. He was almost shot in the head by Hugo.
My name is Connor Kurkowski, son of Michael Jason Kurkowski. This is a picture of the bullet hole that was shot in my grandparents' basement from Hugo Solinsky. Breaks my heart that they had to go through that. They ended up giving him $100,000. My poor grandparents were willing to do absolutely everything and anything to make sure that my father was at least safe and alive.
Michael's dad initially didn't report this incident because he feared it would look as though he was aiding and abetting his fugitive son. But after yet another threat from Hugo, he finally reported the robbery and assault in December of 2002.
But law enforcement was suspicious of this entire situation. Was Mr. Kurkowski protecting his son? Law enforcement was suspicious of everyone involved.
Just because Hugo's extorting money from Michael's parents doesn't mean that he has anything to do with Michael's disappearance. It makes him a person.
The police did go out to the Kurkowskis' home. They took statements and they documented the scene, but they didn't arrest Solinsky. Not yet. They were still gathering evidence. As for Tammy and Michael, it's now coming up on a full year since they disappeared. They could be living it up in some tropical paradise, or maybe they'd met their end. Nobody knew, and it kind of looked like nobody was ever going to find out.
I do not think that enough was being done to find Michael or Tammy, to be exact. I knew that something was really, really wrong. If I knew where she was, I would take her boys to her. I had to keep my sanity. If I didn't, I would drink myself to oblivion.
At this point, it looks like authorities were never going to find Michael or Tammy. Then they get a tip from someone they had no idea had any connection to the case. A convicted felon by the name of Paul Weekly.
Paul got caught up with stealing items from his place of employment, a business that installed water filters.
I arrested him on burglary, theft, receiving charges, some felonies, some misdemeanors.
He was facing a federal probation violation, so Paul Weekly was looking for leniency.
Weekly knows his back is up against the wall, so during his intake interview with the police, he raises a tantalizing question.
Rather spontaneously, he says, you guys, by the way, you guys have any unsolved homicides in your troop or that you're working on? I says, well, yeah, we have quite a few. If you have information that could help us, maybe this could possibly help you. Mr. Weekly was with his attorney, and they had information about some buried bodies at Mount Olivet Road, which at the time was the residence of Hugo Solinsky.
Paul Weekly is a convicted bomb maker and an accused thief, but when he says the phrase buried bodies, everyone goes into action.
Law enforcement descended on Mount Olivet Road. I mean, there was a deluge of state police vehicles, forensic vans.
There was an army of cruisers that just turned into Hugo's driveway. And Hugo said, what are you guys doing? What are you doing here? They told him, we have reason to believe there's bodies buried here.
He scoffed at the notion and said, I'll help you dig. You're not going to find anything here. He was immediately arrogant.
You could understand why Solinsky might be cocky. They could poke around in his yard all day long and find nothing. But what he didn't know was that his best friend, Paul Weekly, had made a deal with the cops.
Hugo Solinsky met Paul Weekly in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. They trusted one another. So when Weekly was released from federal prison, he came out and lived with Hugo and his girlfriend, Tina. The individuals that walked onto this property had no idea what was waiting for them.
Mr. Weekly was transported out to the scene. He said, dig right there. A couple of minutes later, the white plastic flex cuff zip tie was seen protruding through the dirt. And then what looks like a sneaker or a shoe.
Two bodies were removed from that shallow grave.
A coroner does an autopsy, and a forensic odontologist was brought in. He confirmed the identities of Michael Kurkowski and Tammy Fassett through their dental records.
All of a sudden, the news came on, and it was in front of Hugo Selinski's house, and I fell right to the floor and threw up. We shut the TV off because I could take no more.
I mean, this was an earthquake. Police were so convinced that Michael and Tammy had taken a one-way flight to somewhere remote, and here were their bodies, just miles from headquarters.
When I found out that they had been killed, I felt as if it would have been my responsibility to uncover more information. I just didn't have anything that put me in that direction.
This was the biggest story that had ever happened in this community.
And this community will never be the same. They arrested Hugo Selinski and took him into custody for the assault and robbery on Michael Kurkowski Sr. and held him on those charges while they were holding his property and conducting a massive search.
People saying, why not charge him for the murders now? Well, if you charge too early and you don't have your ducks in a row, you can really blow your whole case. So law enforcement will often arrest a potential suspect on whatever charge they can, just to get the suspect off the streets.
Did you kill Mr. Kurkowski?
Absolutely not.
Do you know who did?
Nope.
Through all of this, Hugo's calm, cool, and collective. He tells investigators, I have no idea how these bodies got on the property. He had just purchased that house. So maybe somebody else buried that bodies there when that house wasn't occupied. I mean, why bury bodies on your own property?
Selinski's not talking. The only person who is their informant, Paul Weekly.
So I interviewed Mr. Weekly. During that interview, when he spontaneously said, by the way, there's two more people that were shotgunned and murdered by Mr. Selinski that we didn't even talk about.
It was looking very likely that they had a serial killer on their hands.
Investigators are still on the scene at Mount Olivet Road.
I had many discussions and interviews with Mr. Paul Weekly. After locating the bodies that day at Mr. Selinski's residence, Mr. Weekly said they were buried somewhere else. And he said, and all he did was assist Mr. Selinski in reburying the bodies at this location.
Sure, he led us to the bodies, but he was not being 100% truthful. So when police were searching on that property, they identified two burn pit areas, and they began to sift through that burn pit.
This is bones and fragments from one of the burn pits, later determined to be human bone fragments. So now we're up to, well, at least two bodies and possibly more.
And then one technician notices a little spot of brain matter on Selensky's garage door, and that does have DNA. But the DNA doesn't match Michael or Tammy. It does, however, match a small-time drug dealer named D.A. Keeler. And as it turns out, Keeler and his friend Frank James have been missing now for about a month.
Mr. Weekly explained to us Hugo Selensky was into robbing drug dealers. They were murdered and robbed, and then eventually burned in the burn pit.
When I took over the prosecution, it was readily apparent that the case needed Paul Weekly to come clean about his actual role in the murders of Michael Krakowski and Tammy Fassett.
With Weekly not exactly being forthcoming with the real truth, Michael and Tammy's families would have to wait for justice. But law enforcement does arrest Hugo for the murders of James and Keeler on October 6, 2003. But just 4 days later, Hugo does something that they're still talking about in Luzerne County.
Cellmates 39-year-old Scott Bolton and 30-year-old Hugo Selensky somehow broke the window in their 7th floor cell and rappelled down the side of the building using a rope made of bed sheets.
They tied bed sheets together and made a rope out of it. And then they threw a mattress to lay over the barbed wire. I mean, this is like something out of a Hollywood movie.
Bolton was injured in the escape. He was found on the roof and rushed to the hospital for treatment.
Bolton claimed that Zelensky pushed him out. Zelensky denies this. Either way, Hugo didn't spend any time helping his injured friend out. He was out of there.
I happened to put the news on, and the hair on my neck stood up. Your personal safety, safety of your family, that's the first thing that crosses your mind. Someone like Hugo Selensky, you don't know what their intentions are. Is it payback? You just don't know.
Whenever there's a jailbreak, there's a certain group of people more at risk than everybody else. The detectives, the prosecutors, even the victims' family members. The longer Selensky is out there, the more dangerous it is for them.
When Hugo escaped from jail, my cousins all had their guns ready. They were gonna go hunting down. Even my brothers, even I had mine ready. I mean, I'm not gonna make no bones about it.
On land and on the river, police search for murder suspect Hugo Selensky.
Not only did it cause concern, it also built his infamy. It also built his notoriety. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I was blown away.
The national news, the local news, every time you flicked on the TV set, you got a picture of Hugo Selensky.
The one positive in all this attention is that Hugo's face is everywhere, all across the media. And Hugo's a lot of things, but he's not stupid. And he knows there is no place for him to hide.
Naturally, we were at his house. He had 2 Rottweiler dogs. Normally with strangers there, the dogs would bark. 3 nights later, it was Monday. This night, the dogs didn't bark, which may have indicated Hugo Selensky was at the home. We knocked on the door. He surrendered.
After 3 days on the run, Hugo Selensky surrendered to state police. It was a quiet ending to a massive nationwide manhunt.
Certainly the public was very surprised that Selensky wasn't on his way to Mexico or in California. He was at Mount Olivet Road. I mean, how does a guy scale 5 floors through bed sheets only to turn himself back in 3 days later?
Home is the last place that a fugitive should go. Why did he go there? To get provisions? Say goodbye to his girlfriend, maybe? Perhaps to hide something on the property? We'll never know. But now they at least have their prisoner back in custody. The prosecutors can return to the job of preparing for Hugo's trial for the murders of Frank James and a D.A. Keeler.
Victims' families remain convinced Solinsky is the killer.
If you say you didn't do it, so why you escaped from jail?
Opening statements start on March 1st, 2006, and it is a media free-for-all.
Hugo had a gang of loyalists and fans that were coming in and out of the courthouse every day to see him.
The public was attracted to Hugo because of his looks, his charisma.
Just ready to get this started, that's all.
Women were attracted to his bad boy image.
There were girls writing him in prison, wanting to be his girlfriend.
We were confident that we would have a successful prosecution of Mr. Solinsky for murder and robbery.
But the legal proceedings in this case, I think, were extremely confusing for the jury. Jury decided to acquit on third-degree murder.
When the jury got their verdict form, they had a couple of choices, first degree and third degree. They couldn't agree on first, so they hung, but they did agree on third, and they acquitted.
Because they acquitted on third degree, it's double jeopardy to go after him for first degree. Solinsky can never be tried for those two murders again. The jury, though, did give him 4 years for 2 counts of abuse of corpse. So somehow he found these 2 bodies and then burned them? Many say that is really hard to believe.
We needed to establish a plan B and put together charges regarding Michael Krakowski and Tammy Fassett. I volunteered to help in that effort. I went into that courtroom with about 5 state troopers. He was rearrested immediately for the murders of Michael Krakowski and Tammy Fassett.
It's been nearly 3 years since they found Michael and Tammy's bodies. But finally, Luzerne County charges Solinsky with their murders. There was just one problem: Paul Weekly. It all rested on this one witness, and since that time, he had clammed up.
Paul Weekly originally told investigators not that he helped Hugo Solinsky kill Michael Krakowski and Tammy Fassett, only that he helped with their burial. The team we built focused on finding a way to reach Paul Weekly and have him finally tell the truth. Finally, Paul Weekly said to me that as we continued to put the pressure on, there was nothing left but the truth.
Weekly admits he didn't just help bury the bodies, he was there the whole time. Why would he help kill those 2 people?
Solinsky lobs a barrage of appeals, kicking the can down the road. But in 2015, it was time to pay the piper.
When the time came, we went on the attack.
In 2015 was one of the hardest years of my life, hands down. I was a sophomore in high school. People are going to football games, and I'm going to a trial for my father's murder. I felt very, very alone.
Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but cameras were allowed in the courthouse. And they would bring him down, and Hugo would always look up and say, hey, where's so-and-so today? And then, or he would kind of look my direction and say, I'll talk to you when this is over. Don't worry, just like as if it was an annoyance, and his real goal was to do an interview.
When this is over, and I will do that. No questions right now.
His cockiness and his sense of confidence was like nothing I'd ever seen before.
I was readying myself, always preparing for this date with Selensky. I remember looking at the jury, and I was wrestling with how to start this. And I looked at them and I said, we're going to go on a journey together into the world of Hugo Selensky. And I said, it's a journey I've been waiting 9 years to take you on.
When the trial finally started, I made it a point to be there every day. I walked in that courtroom with my head held high, and Hugo looked right at me, stared me in the face. One of the state troopers came over to me and said, Lisa, you really intimidate him. He went in there and threw his guts out.
So they call Paul Weekly up to the stand to talk about the motive. Weekly testified about the stash of money that Michael Kurkowski had amassed from all of those opioid dealings. Money that Hugo Selensky apparently needed.
Hugo and his girlfriend, they had written out a check for $10,000 for a down payment on the new home that they had just purchased. But there was next to nothing in that checking account.
Paul Weekly said Hugo had to get that check covered, and that they were going to rob and kill Michael Kurkowski on that weekend.
Paul Weekly testified that he was fond of Hugo's girlfriend, and if they could get Michael's money, he knew it would make her life easier.
Paul Weekly agreed to help with the murders because he felt pretty sure Selensky would create that whole ruse that Michael Kurkowski and Tammy Fassett had gone on the lam.
He said they arrive at the Kurkowski residence in the afternoon. Michael is at home, but also in his presence is Tammy Fassett. And Paul Weekly looks at Hugo like, what's she doing here? Hugo didn't want to hear it.
Selensky and Weekly cozy up to the couple, but pretty soon afterwards, Hugo pulls out a pistol, declaring this is a robbery. And it becomes crystal clear that Kurkowski has been betrayed by a man he thought was his friend.
And then they bound Tammy's hands and feet and carried her upstairs.
According to Mr. Weekly, a zip tie was placed around her neck and she was zip tied and suffocated.
Please, God, help me for saying this. I wanted to kill Hugo myself.
They took Michael downstairs, the downstairs basement area. They used a rolling pin to torture Michael. They wanted to know where the money was.
And as he was being beaten, told them they could find money in the drop ceiling. And they did. And then he told them that he had some money at his dad's house that he gave his dad. They put another zip tie around his neck. They engaged it. And he died.
Not knowing what to do with the bodies, Selensky and Weekly put them into Weekly's car and then decided to bury them on the property that Selensky was just about to close on using Kurkowski's money.
So there's a bell in the Luzerne County Courthouse. When the bell rings, you know there's a verdict. During this journey, Mrs. Kurkowski, and she said, why do they take his picture like he's a movie star? And I said to her, when this is over, they're gonna take our picture, you and me. We'll be the stars. We went up together. And when I heard guilty, I'll never forget it. And on the cover of the newspaper hangs in my office, is a picture of Sam and I and me holding Mrs. Kurkowski's hand.
There was a lot of memorable moments in that trial, but I'll never forget sentencing. When Jarrett Ferrantino read Connor Kurkowski's victim impact statement.
I couldn't read it. I couldn't read it then, I can't read it now.
This is what I wrote to the jury for my dad's trial. I cannot fathom the words I need to write or speak. To describe how hard it is to grow up with a very broken life without the father that is supposed to watch me graduate from high school and college and watch me accomplish great things in life. I've never told my story before like this, and it feels good to be able to finally have my perspective be heard. I only tell this kind of thing and talk about this in detail to people that I'm very close with, but this is very special, very freeing.
Hugo Solinsky received 2 consecutive life sentences. Hugo Solinsky will spend every day for the rest of his life in prison.
Tammy Lynn Sands Fassett. I don't know what else to say about her. She was a great person.